March 1242. Across the vast Hungarian plains, the earth was soft with spring thaw, turning roads into quagmires.
Forward! Ride hard! Do not falter!
Yet, through the mud, thundered thousands of hooves, leaving tracks of destruction in their wake. This was no ordinary army. These were the Mongols, masters of mobility, strategy, and fear. Their reputation had spread across Asia and into Europe like wildfire, and now their shadow loomed over Hungary. Just months earlier, they had annihilated the Hungarian forces in one of the bloodiest massacres Europe had ever witnessed. Cities burned, fields were trampled, and the cries of civilians echoed across the plains. And yet, despite standing at the very doorstep of Western Europe, their advance suddenly stopped. The question has haunted historians for centuries. Why would an army that had conquered empires from China to Persia, that had never known defeat, abruptly halt its march at the edge of Europe? For generations, the answer seemed simple. The death of their great Khan Ögödei summoned the Mongol princes back to the heart of their empire. But new evidence suggests that reality was far more intricate.
The river crossing is key. We strike at dawn. Yes, Commander. The riders are ready. Signal the charge. Ride hard and sneer. Push them to the limit. No retreat.
Climate patterns, battlefield tactics, and local resistance all intertwine to shape the outcome in ways previously unimagined. To understand this, we need to journey back to 1206, to the rise of a man who would become legend. Temujin, born into a fractured Mongolia, managed the impossible. He united the nomadic tribes under one banner. He assumed the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler, and began forging what would become the largest contiguous land empire in human history. His power rested not only on fearsome cavalry charges, but on a meticulously organized military machine.
Charge for the Khan! Forward! Trample them!
Fast, disciplined, and inventive, Mongol units could travel over 100 kilometers per day, communicate via flags and signals, and employ psychological tactics that terrorized enemies before battle even began. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, leadership passed to his third son, Ögödei. Though not as naturally brilliant a strategist as his father, Ögödei had a keen eye for talent, most notably the genius of Subutai, the architect of the European campaign. By 1235, Subutai proposed a bold, multi-front assault on Europe. 5 armies would strike simultaneously, aiming not merely to plunder, but to conquer, stretching from the Russian plains to the Atlantic Ocean. The first waves were devastating. In 1236, approximately 150,000 Mongol horsemen crossed the Volga River, sweeping across Eastern Europe like a storm. Bulgaria collapsed, Russian principalities fell, and Kiev was reduced to ashes by 1240. Yet Hungary was Subutai's primary target, the gateway to Western Europe.
Warriors, the path to glory is before us. Hungary will fall, then all of Europe. With courage, we will be victorious! Advance!
Adding fuel to the fire was the presence of the Cumans, a nomadic tribe that had fled Mongol attacks and sought refuge in Hungary. King Bela IV welcomed them, inadvertently provoking Mongol wrath. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, delivered an ultimatum to surrender, but Bela ignored it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shape the destiny of the continent. By March 1241, 3 Mongol armies approached Hungary from multiple directions, a classic Subutai maneuver: divide, distract, and destroy. The main force swept through the heavily defended Vereki Pass, annihilating the army of Count Denis Tamas in mere hours. Observers called their advance lightning fast, barely comprehensible to those trying to follow. Meanwhile, diversionary forces clashed with Polish, Moravian, and Templar knights at Legnica. Here, Mongol ingenuity was on full display. Feigned retreats, smoke-filled battlefields, and encirclements decimated the European coalition. The psychological impact was immense. But these battles were only the beginning. Subutai strategy relied on deception, mobility, and timing. Even as victories mounted, the Mongols' real test would come in Hungary, where numbers, terrain, and resistance could alter even the mightiest army's plans. And as they pressed forward, Europe watched in terror, imagining the worst. Could any force, human or divine, stop them? April 1241. The Hungarian plains trembled under the hooves of the Mongol cavalry. Word of their arrival had spread faster than the wind, and panic had begun to ripple through villages and towns alike.
They're here! Run for your lives! Help me with the cart! We must go now!
King Bela IV, though determined, faced an army unlike any Europe had ever seen, swift, disciplined, and brutal. The Mongols were not merely invaders, they were a force of nature, and Subutai was their master conductor, orchestrating chaos with precision. The first clash at the Sio River near the village of Mohi would become legendary. The Hungarian army, estimated at between 60,000 and 100,000 men, vastly outnumbered the Mongols. Confident, perhaps too confident, Bela believed the river could serve as a natural barrier. That night, the Hungarians successfully repelled a Mongol attempt to cross a bridge, and for a brief moment, hope surged. They returned to camp to celebrate, leaving only a small contingent to guard the bridge, a fatal error. At dawn, Subutai unleashed his plan.
The plan is set. Forward, sons of the great Khan! Unleash the dawn!
Catapults hurled incendiary bombs across the river, the first signs of gunpowder technology imported from China. Flames leapt into the sky, smoke swirling over the battlefield, catching the Hungarians off guard. Yet this was only a diversion. Under the cover of night, Subutai had led 30,000 horsemen on a flanking maneuver, finding a shallow ford and constructing a makeshift pontoon bridge. By sunrise, they were behind the Hungarian lines, cutting off retreat and surrounding Bela's forces. The Hungarian camp, hastily arranged with wagons and tents, became a trap. Chaos erupted as Mongol cavalry attacked from all directions, firing arrows and throwing incendiary devices into the camp. Soldiers screamed, nobles tried to rally their men, but order was impossible. Subutai, ever cunning, deliberately left an opening in the encirclement. Bela, seeing a chance to escape, led his men through it. But this was exactly what Subutai had intended.
Advance! The path is clear! The plan is working! Forward!
Once the Hungarians broke formation, Mongol cavalry struck from every side. The historian Thomas of Split described the aftermath in chilling detail. They fell like autumn leaves, their arms and legs useless in flight or defense. Spears rained down from every direction. The plain was littered with bodies, a river of blood flowing under the sun. It is estimated that over 60,000 Hungarian soldiers perished that day, and nearly the entire nobility was wiped out. King Bela IV narrowly escaped, aided by his bodyguard and the Mongol order to capture him alive. He fled to Austria, where betrayal awaited in the form of Duke Frederick, who imprisoned him and demanded an enormous ransom.
Your defiance is treason. Open the gates. I serve my oath, not your ambition. Then you are a traitor to the realm. The realm stands with me, not your tyranny.
In the following months, the Mongols methodically devastated Hungary. Using clever deception, they forced clerks to write proclamations in Bela's name, instructing townspeople to stay put and avoid resistance. This ruse allowed Mongol forces to move unopposed, slaughtering any who resisted. Entire cities were leveled, villages burned, and fields abandoned. By the end of 1241, Hungary had lost an estimated 25 to 50% of its population, a staggering blow that left Europe in shock. News of the Mongol advance spread fear across the continent.
My lord, the enemy is at the gates! We must flee! Hold your ground! We stand and fight! The maps show a path to the castle, sire. But the women and children, they will be protected.
Rumors painted them as bloodthirsty barbarians, cannibals, or even apocalyptic forces. Europeans compared them to Gog and Magog from biblical prophecy, imagining hellish armies descending from the east. In reality, the Mongols were tolerant of religious practices and disciplined in logistics, but perception was a weapon as potent as any sword. Fear alone paralyzed Europe, as kingdoms struggled to coordinate defenses and aid never arrived from the Pope or other monarchs. Meanwhile, the Mongols continued their advance. By winter 1241, scouts had penetrated deep into Bohemia and reached Vienna. Batu Khan's forces swept through Austria and Moravia, sparing none who resisted and conscripting able-bodied men where they did not. The Mongol army seemed unstoppable.
Charge the British!
Yet even at the height of their power, cracks began to show. Supply lines stretched thin, horses needed pasture, and the terrain itself began to work against them. It was in this context that the first hints of a greater story emerged. The Mongols' seemingly unstoppable march had limits: political, logistical, environmental, and Hungary, though shattered, was not entirely defeated. Logistical, environmental, and Hungary, though shattered, was not entirely defeated. NS in mist and frost, yet the Mongol advance showed no sign of slowing. Winter 1241 had cloaked the Hungarian play. It was in this context that the first hints of a greater story emerged. The Mongols' seemingly unstoppable march had limits. Political, Batu Khan's forces were everywhere, scattered across the countryside, laying waste to towns and fields.
Attack! Leave no one! They're here! Run for your lives!
Their horses grazed wherever grass remained, their arrows darkened the skies, and Europe trembled before them. And yet, despite their dominance, a silent shift was beginning, one that no sword or strategy could dictate. Far to the east, in the distant capital of Karakorum, the great Khan Ogodei indulged in one of his habitual hunts. Known for his love of drink, Ogodei's legendary indulgence often required attendants to monitor his consumption. On the evening of December 11th, 1241, Ogodei drank deeply with companions, boasting of his prowess and issuing commands with a casual air. By dawn he was dead. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some suggest a stroke, others chronic organ failure, exacerbated by alcohol, and whispers of poisoning circulated. Within the Mongol succession system, Ogodei's death was catastrophic.
Our scouts report a large force gathering near the river.
We cannot wait any longer. We must strike first.
All princes and commanders were bound by law to return to Karakorum for the Kurultai, the council that would elect the next great Khan. Yet news traveled slowly. A messenger, even traveling with all haste, would need months to cover the 8,000 kilometers from Mongolia to Hungary. When the commanders in Hungary eventually heard the news, uncertainty gripped them. Subutai, the master strategist, urged caution, but anticipated the continued campaign might still be feasible. Batu Khan, however, faced a choice. Returning to Karakorum could expose him to political danger, especially given the rivalry with Ogodei's son Guyuk. Staying in Europe meant operating far from the center of power, but retaining authority over his army.
Mount your horses! Prepare the lines!
The Mongols were undefeated on the battlefield, yet they were suddenly confronted by forces beyond their control, political obligations, distant deaths, and the ever-looming threat of internal strife. Complicating matters further, the Hungarian campaign had already strained their resources. Horses required thousands of acres of grazing land daily, and the plains, once dry and solid, were beginning to soften under unusually wet winters. The Mongol cavalry, trained for speed and mobility, found themselves slowed by mud and insufficient forage. Their logistical network, flawless in open steppe, struggled with rivers, forests, and snowbound passes.
We must secure the river crossing before the rains come. Move the cavalry immediately.
It was not a single factor, but a convergence. The death of the Great Khan, the slow trickle of political obligation, and the environment transforming the battlefield itself. Batu Khan and his generals had to make a choice: press forward into Western Europe with unknown obstacles ahead, or consolidate their conquests and secure their position. They chose prudence. In March 1242, the Mongol armies began the unexpected march eastward, leaving behind a landscape of devastation, fear, and unanswered questions. For 8 centuries, this retreat was attributed solely to Goday's death. Yet modern historians, combining climate data, archaeological research, and contemporary accounts, reveal a far more complex picture. Europe had survived not only because of chance, but because multiple forces, human, environmental, and political, intersected at precisely the right moment. The Mongol withdrawal, sudden and mysterious to many, was a decision shaped as much by circumstance as by strategy. Spring of 1242 arrived with a muddy and uncertain landscape across the Hungarian plains. For the Mongols, the very terrain they had conquered with ease months earlier had transformed into a formidable obstacle. Subutai, the brilliant strategist behind their European campaign, understood the power of mobility and speed, yet even his ingenuity faced new challenges.
We cross the Sajo here at dawn. The Hungarians are vulnerable. It is a risk. The ground is soft. Fortune favors the bold. Prepare the riders.
The rivers, swollen from spring rains, had turned pastures into marshes. Horse hooves sank deep into the mud, slowing the cavalry that had once seemed unstoppable. Logistics, always the hidden backbone of Mongol campaigns, began to strain. Each horse required daily grazing, yet the soaked land reduced the available forage drastically. With an army of 40,000 men, each commanding multiple mounts, the Mongols faced an unprecedented supply challenge. Previously, they had relied on rapid movement across dry steppe and plundered settlements to feed their forces. But the devastation they themselves had wrought left little foraging behind. Hunger and exhaustion began to gnaw at the once invincible horde. Despite these challenges, Subutai's tactical brilliance remained unmatched.
First unit, break right.
Second unit, follow me!
He continued to organize the army into highly mobile units, prepared to strike quickly and retreat when necessary. Feints, diversions, and sudden encirclements had become his hallmark. Mongol warriors on muddy plains, intimidating European villagers in distance. Yet Europe was not the steppe of Mongolia. Local populations had learned from the Mongol onslaught and adapted.
I see them! Are you sure it's them?
Quiet, they'll hear us.
Villages that had survived the first waves had begun organizing armed resistance. Stone fortifications, rare in Hungary but deadly when present, further complicated the campaign. Mongol siege engines, effective against wood and earthworks, struggled against these resilient structures. European heavy cavalry began demonstrating the potential for organized resistance. Austrian Duke Frederick II orchestrated counterattacks around Vienna. Every skirmish, ambush, and unexpected defense reminded that the Mongols could be challenged. Subutai constantly reassessed his options, calculating risk versus reward with precision.
Push! We must keep moving!
Heave now, all together!
Hungary was no longer a simple conquest, it was becoming a logistical quagmire. Even in these circumstances, the Mongols retained their aura of fear. But the psychological advantage, once absolute, was diminishing. It was in this delicate balance of power, logistics, and local opposition that the Mongols faced their first true strategic dilemma. The army was undefeated, but victory no longer came easily or cheaply. Every advance carried new risks, and Subutai's calculations highlighted the limits of conquest. No longer could the Mongols rely solely on shock and speed. Success demanded more than courage or ferocity. It required resources, coordination, and the unpredictable hand of circumstance. In Part 5, we will explore how these factors, environmental, logistical, and human, combined with news from the east to force the Mongols into a decision that would forever alter the fate of Europe. By the spring of 1242, the Mongol army in Hungary faced a stark reality.
Keep the pace! The enemy awaits! Forward! Through the mire!
For a force that had never known defeat, the challenges were suddenly daunting. Horses, the lifeblood of their mobility, struggled in muddy fields and inundated pastures. Supply lines stretched precariously over rivers and forests, vulnerable to ambushes by Hungarian militias and guerrilla fighters. Villagers, nobles, and remnants of the royal retinue disrupted Mongol movement, destroying bridges and ambushing patrols. Stone castles, once few in Hungary, now proved formidable. The fortress at Chesnek in western Hungary resisted Mongol siege engines, frustrating Subutai's plans for swift victory. Siege after siege drained manpower, consumed resources, and tested the patience of an army accustomed to rapid conquest.
The losses. We cannot maintain this pace.
But Subutai, the fortress is within reach.
At what cost?
Subutai realized the campaign's pace could no longer be maintained without incurring heavy, unsustainable losses. Then came news from the east, the death of Great Khan Ogodei. Though delayed by months, the word reached Batu Khan and the Mongol commanders. The political landscape of the empire itself became a pressing concern. Under Mongol law, all princes were required to attend the Kurultai to elect a new Great Khan. Failure to appear could lead to internal disputes, fragmentation, and civil war. Batu, wise and cautious, recognized the stakes. Even a victorious army in Europe could not ignore the potential for chaos at home. Climate compounded the Mongols' dilemma. 1242 brought unusually wet and cold conditions to the Hungarian plains.
The terrain, it is worse than we thought. Our horses cannot gain purchase in this mud.
What had been dry, solid terrain ideal for cavalry became a swampy expanse. Horses could not move efficiently, pastures were waterlogged, and the army's mobility was sharply diminished. Their traditional tactics of encirclement, lightning raids, and rapid advances were compromised. Without sufficient food for men and horses, prolonged occupation was impossible. Faced with political obligations, environmental challenges, and human resistance, Batu Khan had to make a historic decision. To continue west risked exhaustion, starvation, and disaster. To withdraw preserved the strength of the empire. The Mongols, undefeated but not invulnerable, chose prudence. In March 1242, the armies began the retreat eastward. They left behind devastation but avoided further overextension. Cities remained in ruins, villages abandoned, and Hungary's population decimated. Yet, Europe had been spared complete conquest, temporarily shielded from the unstoppable storm from the east.
The Great Khan is dead. No, it cannot be.
For centuries, chroniclers attributed the retreat solely to Ogodei's death. But modern historians recognize a more nuanced reality. Strategic foresight, environmental change, human resilience, and political necessity all played a role. The Mongols had won battles with devastating efficiency, but Europe had won time. Hungary, though shattered, had forced the horde to reckon with limits. Subutai's genius maximized battlefield victory, yet even his brilliance could not overcome environmental and logistical constraints. The retreat was a calculated choice born from circumstance and strategy. As the Mongols disappeared eastward, the Hungarian plains remained scarred but alive. Survivors would rebuild, learn from devastation, and fortify the kingdom for future threats. Europe, having glimpsed the ferocity of the steppe, understood that preparation, resilience, and adaptation could stand against even the most fearsome forces. After the Mongols withdrew eastward in 1242, Hungary lay in ruins. The plains were littered with burned villages, abandoned fields, and the skeletal remains of towns that had once thrived. King Bela IV returned from his refuge in Austria to survey a kingdom that had lost nearly half its population. The sight was devastating, yet in the midst of despair, Bela understood that Hungary's survival, and the survival of Europe's eastern frontier, depended on resilience and foresight. The first priority was security. Bela recognized that Hungary's earlier weakness had been a lack of fortified structures.
Archers, knock! Fire! They're breaking through! Hold the line!
Previous kings, wary of empowering the nobility, had restricted stone castle construction, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to the Mongols' siege engines. Now, with experience carved into memory by catastrophe, Bela initiated one of the most ambitious castle-building programs of the Middle Ages. Within 3 decades, Hungary would rise from 10 stone castles to nearly 100, strategically located across the plains and along rivers. These fortresses would serve as defensive anchors, safeguarding populations and creating choke points that could stall or repel future invasions. Bela also reformed the army. Heavy cavalry trained to withstand Mongol tactics became the backbone of Hungary's defense. Crossbowmen, inspired by lessons learned at Mohi, were recruited and trained in disciplined formations. Bela extended conditional nobility to settlers who agreed to serve in the military, ensuring a steady supply of trained fighters while simultaneously revitalizing depopulated regions.
General, we are here as requested. Welcome, Commander. Your support is most welcome.
He reached out to Venice, hiring professional crossbowmen to bolster Hungary's defenses, combining local knowledge with foreign expertise. Economic revival was equally critical. The Mongol devastation had destroyed crops and disrupted trade. Bela encouraged settlement in abandoned areas, offering land and privileges to families willing to rebuild. Markets reopened, agriculture recovered, and rivers, once clogged with debris, were cleared to facilitate commerce. It was a slow, painstaking process, but Hungary's recovery demonstrated that human resilience could overcome even catastrophic setbacks. By the late 1250s, Hungary had become a fortress kingdom. The population, though smaller than before, was concentrated around strongholds, prepared to resist invaders with coordinated defenses. Roads and communication lines were improved, allowing rapid mobilization of troops when threats emerged. Bela's reforms were informed by lessons learned from the Mongol invasion. Speed and mobility alone could not secure survival. Strategic preparation, strong infrastructure, and adaptive military tactics were essential. This preparation would soon be tested.
Keep the pace. Nogai leads. The west is ours. Move forward. Form a line. Archers prepare.
In 1285, more than 40 years after the first Mongol incursion, the steppe warriors returned, led by Nogai Khan and Talabuga. They retraced Batu Khan's path, expecting to exploit the same vulnerabilities that had allowed rapid conquest decades earlier. But Hungary was no longer defenseless. Stone castles blocked key routes, while supplies had been stockpiled for prolonged resistance. Guerrilla tactics, familiar from the earlier invasion, were now organized, coordinated, and supported by fortified positions. Talabuga's main force, attempting to advance through northern Hungary, encountered heavy snow in the Carpathians. Horses could not move efficiently, supplies dwindled, and the Mongols faced logistical disasters reminiscent of, but even more severe than, 1242.
Keep pushing for Hungary! Archers, fire! Hold the line, brothers! Retreat, we are broken!
Skirmishes with local militias further depleted their strength, and disease and famine struck the army. The invaders, confident of easy victory, were forced to retreat without achieving their objectives. Hungary had survived stronger, wiser, and better prepared. Bela IV's vision had transformed Hungary into a kingdom that no longer depended solely on hope or luck. By combining fortifications, military reform, strategic settlements, and lessons from previous devastation, Hungary had created a sustainable defense system capable of withstanding even the greatest armies of the steppe. The kingdom's recovery was a testament to planning, adaptability, and the indomitable human spirit, a stark contrast to the chaos left by the Mongol advance. By the mid-1240s, Europe had witnessed the destructive force of the Mongols firsthand. The news of devastation in Hungary, Poland, and the Russian principalities spread like wildfire, striking fear into the hearts of kings, nobles, and peasants alike. Villagers whispered tales of horsemen who could strike with lightning speed, of cities burned to the ground, and of armies annihilated almost overnight. The Mongols' reputation had become almost mythical, an unstoppable storm from the east. Yet, for all their fearsome power, the limits of the horde were becoming clear. Subutai, the architect of these campaigns, was both admired and feared within the Mongol Empire. He had studied Europe's terrain, observed its cities and fortifications, and predicted both the advantages and pitfalls of a prolonged campaign. His strategy relied on mobility, deception, and psychological warfare. Feints, rapid encirclements, and terror tactics had brought victory after victory. But Europe was not the open steppe of Mongolia. Rivers, forests, and fortified cities slowed the Mongols. Unlike the scattered Russian principalities, Western Europe was beginning to organize, preparing to resist with knowledge gained from earlier invasions. While Hungary had borne the brunt of the Mongol advance, the rest of Europe watched anxiously. Austria's Duke Frederick II had demonstrated that local leadership could exploit the Mongols' reliance on speed. Small but well-coordinated armies, familiar with the terrain, could harass supply lines, ambush detachments, and slow the Mongols' advance. These lessons would prove critical in Western Europe. From Subutai's perspective, the empire had reached a crucial juncture. Every mile further west carried increasing logistical risks. Horses required pasture, soldiers needed food, and supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Even the Mongols' formidable adaptability had limits, and Europe's combination of climate, terrain, and human ingenuity began testing those limits in ways the steppe never had. Subutai also had to consider political realities. News of Ogode Khan's death had arrived late, but its implications were profound. Mongol commanders could not ignore succession disputes. Meanwhile, Europe began adapting in ways that would have long-term consequences. Nobles studied Mongol tactics, fortifications were strengthened, and communication networks improved. The combination of natural barriers, heavily fortified cities, and coordinated resistance highlighted that even a seemingly unstoppable force could be checked. Subutai, observing the continent from the plains of Hungary, likely recognized this shift. Victory on the battlefield did not guarantee control of the territory. Prolonged campaigns demanded resources, planning, and compliance from populations, factors that Europe's geography and political fragmentation now complicated. By the end of 1242, the Mongols had retreated eastward, leaving a scarred Hungary and a continent that had glimpsed both terror and survival. Europe had learned its first lesson: no force, no matter how formidable, could succeed without understanding the land, the people, and the limits of endurance. Subutai's campaigns would be remembered not only for their brilliance, but also for demonstrating that strategy must account for factors beyond immediate battlefield victories.